Maurice Hilleman was born right at the influenza pandemic of 1918-1919, which historically was one of the great killers throughout the world.
More people died of influenza in 1918-1919 than soldiers were killed of battle wounds in World War I.
It was an epidemic like no other, killing mostly the young and healthy. Victims would develop symptoms and within hours would be dead, most drowning in their own fluids. Doctors and researchers had no way to treat or prevent the disease.
It was a pandemic, which is basically a worldwide epidemic, and it killed between 50 and 100 million people in the world, one of the biggest plagues of modern man ever recorded.
When the U.S. entered World War II, the Army had to find a way to protect its soldiers. As a young scientist at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, Maurice Hilleman watched as the military struggled to make an influenza vaccine.
The first year was very, very successful because they just happened to match the virus in the vaccine that was causing influenza. In succeeding years, that did not happen.
Hilleman's job was to understand why the Army's vaccine had worked one year and not the next. And more importantly, to prevent another influenza pandemic.
Typically, for viruses like measles or mumps or German measles, natural infection protected you for the rest of your life. That wasn't true for influenza, and no one really could figure out why until Dr. Hilleman.
The virus was changing, but how? What Hilleman discovered was that the spikes on the influenza virus were slowly mutating, so our immune systems couldn't recognize them from one year to the next. Then Hilleman discovered that influenza virus could mutate not just slowly, but immediately, causing worldwide epidemics like the one in 1918-1919. Two animals were necessary for this massive, sudden change. First, birds. Because bird influenza viruses can't attach to human cells, they typically can't infect humans. But when bird flu viruses learn to enter our cells, they can overwhelm us. Where do they learn to do this? Pigs. What makes pigs unique is that they can be infected by both bird and human influenza viruses, making them a great place for the two to mix and create a brand new virus, one that no human has ever seen before. And that's exactly what Hilleman was worried about.
If he hadn't been a virologist, he probably would have been an extraordinary detective, because he could really take disparate pieces of information and pull them together in a way that nobody else saw. And I think that was part of his genius.
With his new understanding of how influenza virus worked, Maurice Hilleman was poised to become the first person in history to recognize and prevent an influenza pandemic.
He came in one morning all excited. He said, "Look at this, Joe. Look at this. Influenza epidemic hits Hong Kong." And this was in the New York Times.
I think a lot of people would have seen that article in the New York Times and said, looks like just an epidemic in Hong Kong. He didn't see it that way. He saw it as the potential beginning of a worldwide pandemic, because something like 10% of Hong Kong's population was suddenly ill by this virus.
20,000 people lined up, and I looked at that. They said babies had glassy-eyed stares. I'm like, God, this is the pandemic. It's here.
Dr. Hilleman said, "Well, we got to get samples from the people that are sick, and we got to get that back here as soon as possible."
And so Maurice then was able to obtain that virus, and he found that no one, apparently, had ever seen this virus before. He was frightened by this, horrified by this.
A flu epidemic that is sweeping the Orient hits Japan. Schools are practically empty in Tokyo, for the chief victims are children. More than 130,000 cases are reported in the space of a few days. Thousands of youngsters go to clinics. Tokyo hospitals are filled.
I was able to announce to the world, and I had guts at that time, that there would be a pandemic which would start when school began in the fall.
If he was right, countless lives would be saved. If he was wrong, millions of Americans would receive a needless vaccine, and his reputation would lie in ruin. The news was quickly spread to the American public.
Throughout history, mankind has been forced to wage many battles against misfortune, disaster, or even possible extinction. Recently, you've become aware of a pandemic, or worldwide epidemic, which is now known as Asian influenza.
Hillman coordinated with pharmaceutical companies to head off what he believed was a coming plague. He even urged chicken farmers to spare their roosters to ensure an ample supply of fertilized eggs to make the vaccine.
Being convinced that we were going to get hit that year made him make 40 million doses of the vaccine to distribute it, which if we had waited for the roof to cave in and then start doing it, we would have been really behind the 8 ball.
When the 1957 school year arrived, so did the Asian flu. Across the country, thousands of Americans would die from influenza, a number that could have reached hundreds of thousands without Hillman's vaccine. His tenacity had paid off. And for the first time in history, a scientist had averted a pandemic. For this unprecedented achievement, Hillman was awarded the military's Distinguished Service Medal.
Whenever you do something like that, you have to A, be pretty confident about what you're doing, and B, be pretty ballsy about it. And I think Maurice Hillman had both of those elements in his personality. He could have turned out to be wrong. He might have been wrong. He wasn't.